it's much harder for Kurt to contain that creature relative to targetable creatures because Kurt has access to Maze of Ith.
Yeah, Kurt has access to Maze of Ith. Obviously, Punishing Fire is great against Delver as well. But yeah, Chris really needs to get those Nimble Mongoose in play because Kurt's deck doesn't really have that many ways to interact with it.
Yeah. So
looks like we have Kurt's going to lead with a Mox Diamond, and Chris is actually going to Force of Will the Mox Diamond. So key play there from Chris. He understands that one of the keys to Kurt's deck is getting a mana advantage, so doesn't want to allow that to happen.
Also, the deck is often missing colored mana, and also his Force of Will is not likely to be very good against other stuff. So
yeah,
a lot of factors.
Kurt's deck doesn't play many spells. It only plays 25 spells. The rest of the deck is all lands. So if you can Force of Will a key spell like Mox Diamonds, it's probably worth it. So Kurt plays a Karakas and a Rashad Import, and then he activates Rashad Import on Chris's upkeep to tap the Misty Rainforest, basically just forcing Chris to sacrifice it and get a land this turn.
And Kurt's game plan long term in this matchup is to establish Loam and essentially lock Chris out of the game by just recurring wastelands. Chris's deck has no copies of basic lands and not a lot of lands total, so this is a pretty effective game plan if Kurt can find Loam and colored mana.
Yeah, currently Kurt does not have colored mana, and Chris does have that Nimble Mongoose that we mentioned before. However, Kurt does have a Tabernacle in his hand, which could put a little pressure on Chris's mana. Here we see Chris lead with a Ponder, trying to get Threshold so that Nimble Mongoose is a little more threatening.
And you can look at Kurt's hand right now of Crop Rotation and Gamble and Exploration, rather, and that Force of Will on the turn 1 Mox Diamond a really critical play.
Yeah, without any colored mana, he's basically not able to cast any of the cards in his hand. Plus, he actually can't cast a Gamble to try to get that life from Loam. But fortunately, he does have the Thespian stage, so he's able to copy a Tropical Island to actually start getting some colored mana.
Yeah, and it looks like Chris is actually contemplating stifling this. He's really committed to trying to keep Kurt off of colored mana.
And I actually don't hate that play because Stifle is not going to do much else in this matchup. You're basically trying to slow him down, slow Kurt down as much as possible.
The issue here is that Chris is only untapping and attacking for 1. If he was applying substantial pressure, I would like to play a little bit more. As it stands, you're hitting for 1 point of damage.
Yeah, I think if you're Kurt, you're probably okay with that. And it looks like Kurt does have a Maze of Ith, but that won't be really effective right now. He does have a Tabernacle though, which Tabernacle is going to come down, and that's going to put a little pressure on Chris's mana because he's going to have to tap a mana to save that Nimble Mongoose on his upkeep.
Yeah, and this is all part of the slow stranglehold Kurt is trying to apply on Chris's resources.
So now Kurt can just activate that Thespian stage again at the end of Chris's turn if he chooses. But although Chris might have a second copy of Stifle in his hand. Kurt attacks with Nimble Mongoose. Again, the Nimble Mongoose does not have a threshold yet, so it's only attacking for 1. So Kurt just drops to 18. Chris adds a Delver of Secrets to his side of the board.
And this is the issue with Chris taking these very aggressive lines of play. Not to say they're necessarily mistakes, but he's just simply not applying that much pressure, and it's unclear long-term if he can really use his resources in such a manner.
Yeah, if you're Kurt, you got to be happy right here. Nimble Mongoose isn't really threatening your life total, plus you have a Maze of It to deal with the Delver of Secrets. Eventually, you have to figure you're going to draw colored mana, and Chris won't be able to stop because you just have so many good cards in your hand. Crop Rotations, Gamble. Chris just won't be able to stop all the cards.
And you had to also be pretty confident against Rogue Delver that, crop rotating and getting Thespian stage plus Dark Depths has to be good enough. He's not going to have Swords of Plowshares or Liliana or anything else that can break that up.
Yeah. So Kurt does get draws a Mox Diamond for the turn, and it looks like it is going to resolve. Chris does have a Force of Will, but chooses not to go fight over this Mox Diamond.
Yeah, I think Chris is aware that he can no longer win this fight against both Thespian stage and the Mox Diamond.
So we're going to see Mox Diamond. It looks like he's going to cast an Exploration this turn. So interesting. He feels like that's the card he wants to get into play more than anything else.
It wouldn't surprise me if his plan here is to Thespian Sage potentially the Volcanic Island, and next turn Gamble for Loam and start getting the ball rolling. And the Exploration is a setup turn here.
The key is he definitely needs to get that life from Loam, and Chris is probably saving the Force of Will for that, although obviously he doesn't know about it, but probably just feels that Mox Diamond can't be fought over at this stage of the game. So Kurt's still in pretty good shape. He's going to take at least 4 damage this turn. I don't believe Chris has Threshold just yet. And Chris is forced to pretty much tie up his mana this turn because he has to spend 2 mana because of the Tabernacle.
Yeah.
Ooh, good draw from Kurt there. He draws a Punishing Fire.
Yeah, that gives him a pretty good solution to this Delver of Secrets that's been flipped.
Again, he still needs an answer to the Nimble Mongoose. He doesn't have a way to really interact with the Nimble Mongoose yet. One way is to sort of get a Wasteland lock going and tie up and remove all of Chris's mana so he can actually pay for the Tabernacle.
Yeah, so you see Kurt here trying to go for crop rotation. And Chris knows that's a death sentence with Thespian Stage in play and fights over it.
So now looks like he's going to tap it for a red, or oh, it looks like he might have actually just copied something with Thespian Stage. So Chris is going to attack. I believe No Mongoose does have Threshold now, so he's attacking for 6. Chris has plenty of mana, but I don't believe he has any counter spells left. So if Kurt wants to resolve the gamble or the crop rotation in his hand, he will be able to. He drew Wooded Foothills for the turn. He has an Exploration in play, so he can still play another land this turn if he somehow gets one. But if he's able to resolve the gamble and get that life from the loam.
And Kurt's taking some big hits here. He doesn't have a lot of time. He also has to be worried about lightning bolts and fort bolts and such off the top of Chris's deck too. So he needs to end this game as soon as he possibly can.
So Spell Pierce from Chris targeting the crop rotation. Kurt does have mana that he can actually use to pay for it. So he sacks the Wooded Foothills in response, dropping him to 7 now.
Yeah, this is dangerous territory. The Nimble Mongoose is now thresholded.
Yeah, so Nimble Mongoose has Threshold. Crop rotation resolves. He's going to actually just find a land for it. He still has that Mox Diamond up, and he's going to get a Glacial Chasm.
Oh, and Glacial Chasm is pretty excellent here as he can start gambling now for loam and really start getting the lock in.
Yeah, so now basically Chris needs to draw a Wasteland to get rid of that Glacial Chasm, try to force through some damage in the key turn.
And this all kind of gets back to earlier where Kurt spent a turn casting Exploration that looked a little bit weird. Now, several turns down the line, it's going to facilitate him getting Glacial Chasm lock set up.
Yeah, so gamble, see what he has to discard. He has to discard Loam, which he's fine with. He'll just dredge it back next turn. He has Thespian Stage, Taiga, Mox Diamond in play for mana, and then he has that Glacial Chasm, which is basically going to fog. And for those of you unfamiliar with Glacial Chasm, we'll bring that up on the screen for you. It's a card that basically, it has a cumulative upkeep of 2 life, but you could and when it comes to play, you have to sacrifice a land. But all damage that is dealt to you is reduced to 0. So it buys himself a little bit of time to make sure that he doesn't die to Chris's attackers. Now he's basically just going to try to set up a lock here with Wasteland and the Life from Loam engine.
Yeah, the other thing that's noteworthy now is that Kurt can, if the cumulative upkeep payment on the Glacial Chasm gets to be too high, he can sack the Chasm, not pay the upkeep, and loam it back. And because he has Exploration in play, he can make 2 land drops a turn, which allows him to play both Glacial Chasm and a land to pay for the cost. So he's got a lot of flexibility now. He is very exposed to Wasteland off the top, of course, but for now he's relatively safe.
Yeah, he could also copy Glacial Chasm with the Thespian Stage. Yeah. So a lot of options here for Kurt. He is at 5, but again, Glacial Chasm basically turns off any damage that he might take. But he has to be wary of cards like Lightning Bolt when that Glacial Chasm has to get sacrificed.
Yeah. So Kurt's done an incredible job of navigating the game into this spot.
Yeah, very understands his deck, knows what he has to do. He was under a little bit of pressure early on, but again, because Chris didn't have Threshold, that Nimble Mongoose wasn't able to do enough damage to really lock up Kurt.
And if you look at the place that the game is at now, I think that the lines Chris took this game actually worked out quite well for him. If he had messed around a little bit too long or waited for higher value spells to force a will, Kurt would have probably been able to establish his soft lock at a pretty high life total. Instead, Kurt's in a pretty good spot, but he still has a lot of potentially harrowing draws he has to fade out of Chris's deck.
Yeah, so I believe on his upkeep, he put the Glacial Chasm effect on the stack, copied it with Thespian Stage, and then didn't pay the cumulative upkeep.
Yeah.
So he still has a Glacial Chasm in play, and now he can play 2 lands this turn. So by doing that, he basically dodges Lightning Bolt from Chris's hand.
Yeah, and what's really cool about Thespian Stage here, you know, we obviously get hung up on the Dark Depths interaction, and that's a real thing. But Kurt's been using it for all sorts of stuff in this matchup. He's been copying Tropical Island to make green mana. He's, you know, bouncing back and forth on his Glacial Chasm to avoid having to pay the upkeep while still giving himself insurance against Wasteland off the top. And I think we're probably not that many turns away from him making a Merit Lage token with it to wrap it all up. So
yeah,
we're getting a real clinic here on the possibilities of Thespian Stage in this deck.
And now he's really, because he's at 5, he really has to kind of make sure he doesn't lose too much. He's trying to just conserve his mana and trying to maximize his plays each turn. He has to make sure that there's always a Glacial Chasm in play so he doesn't potentially die to some burn from Chris. And I believe Chris does have a Lightning Bolt.
Yeah.
So Chris still live here if Kurt basically doesn't sequence things correctly.
But I think at this stage, you know, Kurt's willing to spend some time to play this safe.
So it looks like he's going to lose both his Glacial Chasms, and currently I do not believe he has a Glacial Chasm in play, so he is vulnerable to any burn potentially. But Chris only has 1 Lightning Bolt, so it looks like looks like Chris might respond. Yeah, I think they're checking to make sure that the Thespian Stage isn't a Glacial Chasm, and it is not. So Chris does have a window to Lightning Bolt Kurt, dropping him to 2. So now Kurt can never pay the upkeep on Glacial Chasm. He's going to have to actually just Thespian Stage it each turn, which I think he's fine with. But again, it puts pressure on his mana. He basically has to tie up 2 mana and the Thespian Stage each turn.
Yeah, it's a lot of development, and he also has to periodically sacrifice lands to his Glacial Chasm as well when he has to replay that. So
yeah, so it's a tough spot for him. Good news is Chris is out of cards in his hand, so he could potentially just dodge any more burn. But again, he can't afford to pay the upkeep even once with Glacial Chasm. So Dark Depths does come into play here. And it looks like he doesn't have any mana to actually activate the Thespian Stage at the end of turn. So it looks like he's just going to cast Punishing Fire on one of the Delver's Secrets. Glacial Chasm, the upkeep does not get paid. And he dodges a burn spell. That was Chris's window basically to have a burn spell because there isn't another copy of Glacial Chasm in play.
Yeah, Kurt just has to cross his fingers here. It gets a lot easier once he's able to, you know, make a Merit Lage token and play Glacial Chasm. But
so now he's going to be able to get 2 lands, one of them a Glacial Chasm, and then anything else, it doesn't matter as long as it taps for mana because he can play 2 lands this turn. And he'll have enough mana to play the Glacial Chasm and then still activate. Oh, no, he can't. He actually can't activate the Thespian Stage because it's tapped. So, yeah, it looks like he's still going to have to dodge another burn spell next turn.
This got awkward. It looked like he had the resources to juggle these Glacial Chasms back and forth, but that Lightning Bolt's throwing everything for a loop.
Yeah, he just keeps losing a mana each turn because the Glacial Chasm forces him to sack something. And he doesn't have enough mana to really get anything else going here. So looks like he's going to play a Wasteland. And yeah, he's in a really tough spot here. He just can't kind of get that mana advantage. And he's not drawing any other cards because he keeps activating Life from them. So it's not like he's going to draw a second Exploration or a Mana Bond. Mana Bond obviously would be huge for him because it allowed him to play all the lands from his hand. But he's not drawing any cards for the foreseeable future. So it looks like, yeah, he's going to actually copy the Glacial Chasm this turn. So this will give him a turn where he can actually develop his mana.
Yeah, and he really needs to do this. This is what's going to allow him to possibly push ahead a little bit.
But this could be huge here because Chris does have a Stifle. So Kurt cannot pay the upkeep on Glacial Chasm. So the Glacial Chasm will have to go to the graveyard. If Chris stifles the Thespian Stage activation, then he will be exposed to burn. Chris does not have a burn spell, but it looks like he is going to allow that to resolve. And now Life from Loam is going to get dredged back. And he can play 2 lands this turn. One of them is going to be a Thespian Stage. He will cast Life from Loam to get another land into play. Let's see here. Likely going to get a Glacial Chasm. He gets a Dark Depths and a Tranquil Thicket.
And the Tranquil Thicket is subtly really important for him here too, as it gives him the opportunity to potentially draw a card. And if he's able to find Mana Bonds or even another copy of Exploration, he gets a lot of breathing room to start developing.
Well, now I think he's okay because on his upkeep, he can just activate the second Thespian Stage copy the original Thespian stage, copy the Glacial Chasm, and then he's going to net another land this turn, I think. So let's see if he does do that. Yes, he is going to try doing it again. Again, Chris does have that Stifle. Let's see if he wants to use it this time. And he chooses not to. So Kurt still has that Glacial Chasm in play. And now Kurt's debating if he wants to dredge back life, but he's not. He's just going to draw a card. Draws a Maze of it. Not that relevant right here.
Yeah, again, Chris only needs to attack him once, and he does have a Nimble Mongoose that's untargetable here. So.
And here we go. We have Glacial Chasm and Thespian Stage in play. Dark Depths and Thespian Stage in play. And Kurt does have enough mana to actually activate the Thespian Stage, targeting Dark Depths to get that Marit Lage token in play.
So you see Chris flip over his Delver here, obviously not interested in drawing Daze at this juncture of the game. He's going to shuffle after flipping.
So let's see if Kurt activates Thespian Stage targeting the Dark Depths at the end of Chris's turn. Chris could stifle that. And that would make it awkward for Kurt, because he basically, I think that's going to give Chris an opportunity to actually draw a burn spell here and possibly win the game on Kurt's upkeep.
Yeah. The Stifle plus a burn spell is going to let him steal this one.
Yeah, so let's see if he's able to draw a Lightning Bolt here. It has to be an instant speed burn spell, but it looks like he drew a Daze despite the fact that he shuffled one away.
And watching Kurt navigate this is really impressive.
Yeah, he's been under a lot of pressure simply because he just doesn't have that much mana to work with, so he's been slowly trying to grind it up. So Chris is reading Glacial Chasm just to make sure he understands exactly what's happening here. That tap Thespian Stage in the red zone, that is a Glacial Chasm that was copied earlier in the game. So now Kurt has some choices to make at the end of Chris's turn. Let's see if he wants to activate Thespian Stage targeting Dark Depths, or if he wants to use it targeting the Glacial Chasm that is copied by the other Thespian Stage. Obviously, he wants to get that Marit Lage token in play, but at the same time, he doesn't want to expose himself to a burn spell ever.
Yeah, and the other issue is that it's a 2-turn clock because there is a blocker in play.
Yes. So it's not like he will guarantee win the game next turn. So it looks like this is going to resolve. Stifle will not get targeted. And I don't believe, so there isn't another Glacial Chasm or Thespian Stage in play. Because that Thespian Stage, I believe, that Thespian Stage targeted Dark Depths, and the other one's a Glacial Chasm. So Kurt won't have a Glacial Chasm in play on his upkeep, but again, we know Chris doesn't have a burn spell. Yeah.
And also remember there was a Punishing Fire that Kurt played on that Delver of Secrets a while back. So if Kurt is able to loam up a Grove, he can actually end the game this turn in one shot.
Yeah. And I believe we're looking to read Dark Depths. Chris has that Stifle, so I think he wants to know if he can stifle the Marit Lage token coming into play.
Yeah. And it is a trigger, so.
Yeah. I believe the issue was that Kurt had a 4 in Dark Depths in his graveyard, so he couldn't read that one. Yeah, so there is a trigger. He could stifle that ability.
I'm not actually positive the exact wording on Dark Depths. I don't know if it says if there is 0, then.
Yeah.
Although that would still be a trigger, so Stifle has to be able to catch this at some point, I would assume.
Yeah, I believe he can stifle that, or he could have even stifled the Thespian Stage activity, but when Dark Depth has no ice counters on it, sacrifice it. So I don't believe he has an option there. He could have stifled the Thespian Stage activation.
Yep. So this is another issue, if you're playing Legacy, a lot of the decks like lands. Some of the more complicated and less played decks, there's a lot of really weird subtle interactions, and Thespian Stage is doing all sorts of stuff.
And the thing is, we know Chris doesn't have a burn spell, so even if he does have some sort of interaction there, he's really only buying himself one turn to try to draw that burn spell. But it looks like he doesn't have it anyway. Now Kurt can actually cast Life from Loam, get back the other Glacial Chasm, or he actually has one in his hand, just play it, and then that should be enough. He just needs another. He even has the Thespian Stage in his hand as well.
Yeah. So we could have gone very aggressive here and tried to get back Punishing Fire and kill the Insight Tile Aberration this turn, but this is, of course, much safer.
Yeah. So this is pretty much a hard lock for Chris. Chris does have Brainstorm. He still has that Stifle, though. he needs a burn spell, though. And it looks like he did draw an instant speed lightning bolt, so this could be very interesting. Kurt does have that glacial chasm. He can't pay the upkeep on it, though. So, but as long as, so if Chris tries to activate the Thespian stage on his upkeep, and if Chris stifles it, I believe that'll give him a window to cast lightning bolt.
Yep. We'll see how this gets navigated.
I don't think Chris wants to activate Thespian Stage at the end of Chris's turn, targeting Glacial Chasm, because then he'll have 2 upkeeps to pay. So I think he wants to do it on his upkeep. Yeah, and now Chris can stifle the activation, and that should be it.
Yep.
He will be left without a Glacial Chasm play. Shields are down, and Lightning Bolt gets resolved. So Kurt Spiess, despite his best efforts, falls to Chris Yarbough in the first game, and it all came down to that Lightning Bolt getting drawn. I mean, Chris had that stifle. He was patient. He was just waiting. Finally draws the instant speed burn spell, and Kurt Spiess, despite his best efforts, loses the first game.
And it makes me wonder if Chris played the game that way, not fighting over the Dark Depths, because he knew that that was kind of a hopeless battle. Eventually, Kurt was going to be able to reestablish it, and what he actually needed to fight over was a Thespian Stage or a Glacial Chasm to set up a lethal Lightning Bolt.
Yeah, I think Kurt did everything he kind of could try to do to keep the shields up, so to speak, as long as possible. He just didn't have that much mana to work with. So there were several turns where he just had to hope to dodge a burn spell from Chris, and he did for several turns up until that last turn. So unfortunately there for Kurt, despite the fact that he played very well, Chris Yarbough was very patient and was able to steal that game.
Okay, so let's go on to the sideboard here. You've got Kurt's in front of you.
Yeah, so Kurt has interesting sideboard. He's got 4 Crossing Grips, 4 Sphere Resistance, 2 Thorn of Amethyst, 1 Crop Rotation, 2 Dark Depths, 1 Bojuka Bog, and 1 Chalice of the Void. Honestly, there's not that many cards that he has against Rug Delver. Obviously, Chalice of the Void on 1 can be very, very good against Rug Delver, so I expect that card to come in. Crossing Grip, not really a card you need in this matchup. He doesn't expect to see a card like Rest in Peace out of Rug Delver, which is, one of your big fear cards. Sphere and Thorn of Amethyst, those are really for combo decks, not for this matchup. And Crop Rotation could be a little scary to bring in against a deck like Rug Delver, simply because they have so many counter spells. So you don't want to lose a land and get your spell countered.
I do like bringing in the Bojuka Bog as sort of a value land, as Chris is really leaning on his graveyard. Of course, Tarmogoyf and Nimble Mongoose are his threats. So
yeah, it definitely would have been great in the first game to shrink that Nimble Mongoose even earlier.
Yeah. On the other side, Christopher's sideboard has 3 copies of Submerge, 2 Rough Tumbles, 2 Grafdigger's Cages, 3 Pyroblast, 2 Ancient Grudges, a Light from the Loam, Sulfur Elemental, and a Dismember. His sideboard really offers very close to no help here.
Yeah, and honestly, if you're playing against a deck like Lands, really the only sideboard cards that you can have against them that are really of any good are graveyard removal cards. So cards like Tormod's Crypt, Surgical Extraction, Rest in Peace. Obviously, Rug Delver, we have seen Rug Delver decks play Surgical Extraction in the past, or Tormod's Crypt, although unfortunately his graveyard quote-unquote sideboard hate is Grafdigger's Cage, which isn't really effective against a deck like Lands.
Right. He would ideally want something like Tormod's Crypt, Surgical Extraction, or so forth.
And it's tough. All the Rug Delver decks, they need some sort of graveyard hate in their sideboard. All the different pieces of hate have their benefits. Tormod's Crypt is obviously very fast. You can get into turn 0. It helps you against decks like Dredge much more than anything else. However, Grafdigger's Cage actually has a lot of versatility against elves as well, because it turns off their natural orders in Green Sun Zenith. So you can see the logic there.
Yeah. Now, the graveyard cards in Legacy, they look interchangeable on the surface, but they're often, one's significantly better or worse in different matchups.
Yeah, like Rest in Peace is probably the biggest hoser, but it costs 2 mana. So that can get Thoughtseize, they can get Cabal Therapied. So obviously every piece has their pluses and minuses. So Kurt's going to lead with a Mox Diamond, and it looks like Chris does have a Force of Will, and we might see the same play we saw in the first game, where turn 1 Mox Diamond from Kurt get Force of Will by Chris. And that put a lot of pressure on his mana, on his colored mana in game 1, but Kurt does have a Wooded Foothills to kind of get his action going this turn.
It looks like Kurt's draw this game is just much less susceptible to this line of play. The other game, he didn't have colored mana, or at least didn't have green mana, and has spin his tires for a couple turns trying to Thespian Sage an opposing Tropical Island. This looks a little different.
This is a great start for Kurt. Despite the fact that he got his Mox Diamond countered, he does have a Life from him, and he has a Wasteland as well.
Yeah, you couldn't draw this opening hand up much better if you're Kurt.
Yeah, so fortunately for Chris, though, Chris does have a Nimble Mongoose, though, which is one of the key cards in this matchup.
And this is a brutal opening.
Yeah, Exploration, Life from Loam, Wasteland You. Very, very incredible start from Kurt here. Chris has the Nimble Mongoose, but it might not be enough given the fact that Kurt's draw is just so good. And Chris decides to lead with, oh, wow. So Chris thought about leading with Delver Secrets, decides to get that Nimble Mongoose, the second Nimble Mongoose in play, which I like because Nimble Mongoose is really the card you want in this matchup, and you don't want to expose yourself to getting Wasteland locked and not being able to cast your second Nimble Mongoose.
Yeah, you've already seen Punishing Fire. You know Mazavith is in this deck. I think you just have to go with Nimble Mongoose here. He does give up a little bit of damage next turn, potentially, if his Delver were to have flipped, but there's a good chance that Kurt is just able to pretty trivially deal with the Delver of Secrets. Nimble Mongooses are much more challenging.
Yeah, and the cool thing for Kurt that he can do this game is he can get rid of the Tropical Island, and now he can crop rotate for a Tabernacle.
Yeah.
And let's see if he decides to do that.
Here's the thing. Maybe he's going to do it this turn. It almost feels like there isn't even that much of a rush.
Yeah, the question is you don't want Chris to draw a Forcible because you really can't force yourself to get that forced.
Yeah, sure.
You need that Tabernacle because it's your only way to deal with the Nimble.
Yeah, Chris has seen enough. He doesn't want any more of this.
Wow, so turn 3 kill from Kurt Spiess' land deck.
Historically not known for the speed of its kill, but against these all non-basic land tempo decks, that kind of opening is just going to be game over.
Yeah, getting Wasteland locked that quickly is just, especially when your opponent has Exploration. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better start from Kurt.
Yeah, and another thing that I like about Kurt's list a lot is we've seen land decks in various iterations over the last couple of years. Keenan Haas winning the first Open in Indianapolis with his Jund Depths list. A lot of these decks have gone away from cards like Exploration and Mana Bonds. They play some Mox Diamonds maybe and some crop rotations. That could be, kind of backdoor mana acceleration or at least flexibility in some slots or in some spots. Exploration and Mana Bonds lead to some incredibly powerful openings. It does make you a little bit more all in on Loam because these cards aren't good until you have Loam going in most spots. But Kurt is supplementing Life from Loam with Gamble, which can make that go. So Kurt's deck in a lot of ways is harkening back to the land strategies that I saw, 3 or 4 years ago be popular, but is incorporating Thespian Sage, a relatively new card, to very good effect.
And I have to say, this matchup seems, despite losing the first game, it seems pretty good for the lands deck. I mean, game 1, if he was able to draw colored mana a little earlier, I think he's probably in a much better position to win the game. And I think the Rug Delver, their only shot really is to get Nimble Mongoose online pretty quickly. Yeah. Because the other creatures aren't really that impressive against Kurt's deck.
Absolutely. Of all the Delver strategies, Rug is the one with the most game against lands, as you have Nimble Mongoose and burn spells. And that's just a better recipe than the stuff that the other decks are bringing to the table. Thoughtseizes, Hymn to Torak out of a bug deck, that's not really giving you much help against lands. And certainly Stoneforge Mystic for Umezawa's Jitte or Batterskull doesn't really have anything that's going on with the games. So the matchups are all uphill for Delver strategies, but Rug has the most game. And we saw that in game 1 for Chris as Lightning Bolt and Nimble Mongoose played critical roles in him stealing that game, whereas other Delver strategies would have not had those kind of tools and would have likely lost fairly easily to what Kurt was doing.
Yeah, and I think, Kurt kind of understands how good his creature matchups are because his sideboard is basically almost all devoted to combo decks.
Yeah, he has to. I mean, the 4 spheres and the 2 thorns and the chalice all give him some game, and that's a requirement because game 1 his deck is doing nothing that important against a deck like Ad Nauseam.
Yeah, you don't want a hand of Mazaviths and Glacial Chasms against Ad Nauseam. So Kurt Spiess looks like he's happy with his opening 7. Chris Yarbrough's on the play, and he's going to mulligan, so he's going to go to 6 cards.
Yeah, it doesn't look like Kurt. Kurt has it looks like an Exploration, a Wasteland. Nothing too explosive to do just yet, but some tools to work with.
And that is the other kind of cool thing about lands is that it doesn't seem like it would have to really mulligan very much. Like 6 lands and a Wasteland and a Life from Loam was probably a pretty awesome hand against certain decks. So just because your lands have so much value.
Yeah, speed is at a premium in some matchups, so.
Yeah, it looks like he has a Mox Diamond again, and he has the Exploration Wasteland. So this could be a really good start for Kurt if he can resolve that Exploration. Yep, we're going to see a Wasteland. Now we're going to see a Mox Diamond. So Wasteland takes care of any potential days, and now we're going to get a Mox Diamond resolving and an Exploration and a Tabernacle.
Not a bad opening.
So pretty good start there for Kurt. He doesn't have the life room loam, unfortunately, though. So Chris has a Wasteland. Now we're going to see Kurt cycle a Tranquil Thicket to draw a card. Draws a Maze of It. He now plays a Wooded Foothills. And he could cycle yet again. He can play a second land this turn. Wooded Foothills was his first land. He has a second land option off of Exploration.
And Kurt with a lot of really big draws from here naturally. He doesn't have anything right now, but either Life from the Loam or Gamble, if they resolve, allow him to just go completely nuts.
Yeah, and I don't believe Chris has a Force of Will in his hand. Life from the Loam, obviously the best draw, because even if it does get countered, he can still just dredge it next turn. So Kurt in pretty good shape, despite the fact that he doesn't have that Life from the Loam engine just yet. So Chris has 4 mana in play to Chris's 1, and Chris doesn't have any colored mana whatsoever, so just has that Wasteland. Looks like, can't make out what that last land is, but looks like Chris just going to pass the turn. Chris passes back, still no land.
It's a Bojuka Bog.
Oh, Bojuka Bog, okay. So Chris did board in that Bojuka Bog, and now it looks like Kurt drew a Crop Rotation.
Yeah, and Kurt's still in no rush to do anything, while Chris is not doing anything. So even though he could try to resolve this, could try to resolve this Crop Rotation fine, a Wastelander report, there's just no rush.
Yeah. So Dark Depths gets drawn, so there is a potential win condition.
And Kurt can just start going manual style here. If Chris isn't going to do anything, just start removing some counters.
Chris did draw a land in Volcanic Island, and it allowed him to cast Brainstorm, but it won't allow him to cast the Tarmogoyf in his hand. So Brainstorm gets cast. See if he can find more land. Looks like he drew a Wasteland and a Scalding Tarn, as well as a Spell Snare. So I think he put some of the Dazes on top of his deck. Now he's able to at least shuffle one of them away with the Scalding Tarn.
Yeah, again, the ship has sailed on Daze being a productive card this game.
Yeah, Daze, even Spell Pierce is going to be tough to really get it to resolve. So Scalding Tarn gets sacked to likely get a Tropical Island. And let's see if we're going to see a Tarmogoyf enter play here.
And Chris has got to get the ball moving fast here, because if Kurt finds a loam, it's going to be real hard for Chris to win.
Well, the thing that he has to concern with is he can't tap that Wasteland, because if Kurt does have that Crop Rotation, if he doesn't know about the Crop Rotation, but if Kurt uses it to get a Thespian stage, the game's just over.
Yeah.
So, yep, manual, remove 1 counter from my Dark Depths. There's a Maze of It. And like you said, he still has that Bojuka Bog, so even if the Nimble Mongoose isn't close to getting Threshold just yet, but the second it is, Bojuka Bog can come down and shrink it again to a 1/1, which is going to be very difficult for Chris to overcome.
And that Wasteland is down. You mentioned this before. If that Wasteland gets tapped, we could be looking at Merit Lage.
And Kurt's thinking about casting Crop Rotation in response, because he doesn't want Chris to play a Wasteland on his turn and get back priority. So yeah, Crop Rotation is getting cast. He's going to sacrifice his Taiga, and it looks like it will resolve. I don't think Chris has any hard counters. He has multiple copies of Spell Pierce and Daze, but Kurt has plenty of mana. So
actually, Kurt really doesn't have that much mana. For all the lands he has in play, he's only got 3 mana.
Oh yeah, so a Spell Pierce will force him to. Oh yeah, so Spell Pierce will force him to tap 2 mana, and now the 2 Spell Pierce is able to counter a Crop Rotation. So pretty good turn there for Chris. He dodges just straight up losing to the Dark Depths. And he also has a second Wasteland in his hand. So you can actually play the Wasteland and deal with the Dark Depths right now if he chooses.
The big concern here, of course, is still that Bojuka Bog in Kurt's hand is going to reset all the graveyard development Chris has done here. And it's going to take him a really long time to be able to get that Nimble Mongoose back up to Threshold. And his Tarmogoyfs are also going to be poor draws. Well, not particularly poor draws, as Kurt has a graveyard as well, but still.
Yeah. But he doesn't have that many variety of spells in there. And yeah, you're right. Kurt's basically going to drop to 16 here. But then he's going to be left with really nothing left in his hand other than like a Spell Pierce and I believe a Daze and just a Wasteland. So Bojuka Bog comes down, removes Chris's graveyard. So now that Nimble Mongoose is just a 1/1. And yep, Kurt's still in pretty good shape despite the fact that he can't find that life from him.
Yeah, I mean, right now his Dark Depths is winning the race against this Nimble Mongoose.
Yeah, and the great thing, that is true. Wasteland can eventually take care of the Dark Depths if he chooses, but the good thing for Kurt, though, Kurt isn't aware of this, but Chris doesn't have any graveyard removal. So if he draws the Life from Loam, he's in good shape. So it doesn't really matter. He doesn't have to worry about a card like Tormod's Crypt or Surgical Extraction. So Mana Bond comes down here, and it will resolve. Chris draws a lightning bolt. But again, that Nimble Mongoose is just a 1/1, so really not applying that much pressure. Kurt just drops down to 14 from this attack. Dark Depths is going to get another counter removed. There are 3 Wastelands in play, though. And there's a gamble from Kurt, so gamble will get cast right away. And Chris does not have a hard counter for it. He has a Spell Snare and a Daze, neither of which will be able to counter this. So Life from Loam is going to be the card that he's going to get. And even if it does get discarded, he's just going to dredge it back next turn.
And it's interesting. Would have Chris been better served simply using all of his Wastelands to blow up, say, the Bajuka Bog and the Groves, and trying to cut Kurt off of mana? For all the lands that Kurt has in play, 3 of them don't make any mana. He would have been down to just Mox Diamond.
Yeah, so he would have just, so you're right. If he was able to actually just Wasteland all of the colored mana that Kurt has, he could have actually just dazed that spell.
And now all hell is going to break loose. Or perhaps in a turn or 2.
So Spell Snare does slow things down a little bit for Chris. And Chris now has at least 1 card in his graveyard. So he draws a Ponder. That'll give him some action here.
But now here's the issue, is that Chris absolutely needs to fire off these Wastelands.
Yeah. He has to get rid of, if he gets rid of all 3 of the colored mana, Kurt actually won't be able to recast the Life from Loam. He only has that Mox Diamond for mana currently. And he has a Maze of it in his hand.
He's drawing an Ancient Grudge too.
Wow. So great turn here. He can actually sack both Wastelands, take out both Grove of the Burn Willows, and Kurt won't have any access to green mana. And that's exactly what he does.
Yeah, Kurt needs to draw green mana now, or the Wasteland's going to take out the last of his mana.
Wow, Kurt just has a Maze of it in his hand. So, wow, all of a sudden, Chris has 5 cards in his graveyard. He's 2 away from Threshold. And Kurt just draws a Wasteland, a Life from Loam. So, Kurt under a lot of pressure here suddenly. Yeah, Chris has a Lightning Bolt in his hand, so he can get Threshold this turn if he takes out the Bajuka Bog with the Wasteland. He drew a Brainstorm as well, so really good shape here for Chris.
And Nimble Mongoose again rearing its ugly head against lands.
Yeah.
That's a big difference in this matchup.
They have no way to really interact with it. So Chris draws 3 cards off the Brainstorm. He's going to put a Lightning Bolt on top of his deck. And it looks like he's going to keep that Daze because suddenly that Daze is live.
Oh, it's real good now.
So I think if you're Chris, you want to Wasteland that Bajuka Bog. You just want to keep him off of any mana whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because obviously, even if Kurt draws 1 land, he can use it to cast Life from Loam. So you just want to make sure he doesn't have any colored mana whatsoever.
And with that mana bonds in play, once it happens once, it's happening for the rest of the game.
Yeah.
Because he's going to put all of his lands into play at once, dredge loan the following turn, get a bunch of stuff, and then that's going to be it.
Yeah, so he's just making sure Dark Depths isn't nowhere near being active. So
he's brought in his loam. Oh my goodness. This is if Kurt loses, this is getting loam locked by the Rug Delver deck is a humiliating way to go out. That's really rough. That is really rough.
So Kurt draws a Thespian Stage, so there's 1 mana for him. He doesn't play it this turn because again, when he draws the 2nd mana, he has that mana bonds in play. So he doesn't need to play it now, but yeah, it looks like Wasteland's going to take out a Dark Depths. And Kurt is just left with a Tabernacle and a Maze of It in play. Maze of It doing nothing. Kurt drops to 9 from a Lightning Bolt. So now he's suddenly on a 3-turn clock. Kurt draws a land. Is it a green source? It is. It's a Grove of the Burn Willow. So suddenly, with the expiration, he can play 2 lands this turn. He can cast the Life from Loam in his hand. Although, wow, Chris does have that Daze, and suddenly the Daze is live now.
Well, we got to wait a minute here. Let's see if Chris is letting this resolve or not.
If you're Chris, I have to imagine you want to counter it, right? You slow him down for a turn. You can't let him play more lands off the mana bond.
Yeah.
That Daze isn't getting better, so
yeah.
So he just hard cast Daze, and now Kurt is going to get that green sourced Wastelanded. So Kurt, it looks like Kurt's still going to be on a 2-turn clock here. It's going to be tough for him to come out of this one. Let's see if Chris draws a Lightning Bolt to seal the deal. He draws a Force of Will. Well, that's not really active right now, but Chris plays the Wasteland, takes care of the green source from Kurt, and attacks him down to 3. So Chris needs to draw a green source here. Really has no other choice. He can't dredge life from the loam. And even still, even if he does draw a green source, he doesn't have the life in his hand anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't think Kurt has any outs here. Yep, Rashad important. That's it. Wow. Kurt Spiess falls to Chris Yarbough. 2-1. Unbelievable.
It's almost hard to know exactly what happened there. You know what I mean? It felt like Kurt had all the tools in games 1 and 3 and just sort of had it stolen from him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in both games, it felt like